Okay. All right. Well, good afternoon, beloveds. All right. We are getting ready to do Chapter 5 of Reading the Bible Again for the First Time by Marcus Borg. It is before Jesse is teaching Bible Wisdom class, and this is the book of choice. And if you haven't read it, I do highly suggest it, whether you're taking the class or not, because it kind of gives you a new perspective on the Bible, or a different perspective on the Bible at least. And it is coming from somebody who truly loves the Bible as well as is an excellent scholar. So that is what we are doing. So let's get on with this, because Chapter 4 took almost 2 hours. And I hope that this one does not take that long. But if it does, well, we're here for it. We're going to get through Chapter 5 one way or another. So, Reading the Bible Again for the First Time by Marcus Borg, Chapter 5, Reading the Pentateuch Again. Israel's story of the beginning of the world in Genesis 1 through 11 is followed immediately by her story of her own beginning. The story fills all 5 books of the Pentateuch. As in the creation story, God is the central reality and actor. The one who created heaven and earth now creates Israel. Israel's story of her origins begins in Genesis 12 with God's call of her nomadic ancestors, Abraham and Sarah, and continues through 3 generations of their great-grandsons, the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel, who are living in Egypt as Genesis ends. The subsequent 4 books of the Pentateuch narrate the story of Israel's birth as a people and a nation. The Exodus from Egypt under the leadership of Moses, the covenant and the giving of the law at Mount Sinai, and the journey through the wilderness to the border of the Promised Land. That's a lot. Okay. Ooh, followed immediately by the beginning. Embedded within the narrative of the Pentateuch are the 613 laws revealed by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. The most famous of these are, of course, the 10 Commandments. But the laws of the Pentateuch address far more than those 10 issues. They cover not only what we think of as ethical and ritual matters, but also matters of civil and criminal law. In a comprehensive sense, they functioned as both constitutional and statutory law for ancient Israel. By grounding them in her story of sacred origins, Israel gave them the status of sacred laws. The combination of sacred narrative and sacred law made the Pentateuch the foundation of ancient Israel's life. It not only told the story of Israel's creation, but shaped the world in which she lived. Okay, so the story crystallized. A very compact version of Israel's story of origins is included in Scripture as part of the ritual of offering the first fruits of the harvest to God. A wandering Armenian was my ancestor. He went down to Egypt and lived there as an alien, few in number, and then he became a great nation, mighty and populous. When the Egyptians treated us harshly and afflicted us by imposing hard labor upon us, we cried to the Lord, the God of our ancestors. The Lord heard our voice and saw our affliction, our toil, and our oppression. The Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, with a terrifying display of power and with signs and wonders. And the Lord brought us into this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. Okay, that's note 1, which is Deuteronomy 26:5-9, which is where those lines came from. A generation ago, many Hebrew Bible scholars saw this text as a unit of very early oral tradition, much older than the first written accounts of Israel's story. The present generation of scholars is less certain about this. In fact, many now see it as a late summary. But whether early tradition or late summary, it crystallizes Israel's story as found in the Pentateuch as a whole. Okay, note 2, which is a long note, so hold on. Another compact summary also cited by a previous generation of scholars is as early tradition is found in Deuteronomy 6:20 through 24. Here, the context is instruction of children. When your children ask you in time to come, what is the meaning of the decrees and the statutes and the ordinances that the Lord our God has commanded you, then you shall say to your children, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. The Lord displayed before our eyes great and awesome signs and wonders against Egypt, against Pharaoh and all his household. God brought us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land that God promised on oath to our ancestors. Then the Lord commanded us to observe all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God for our lasting good. So that's interesting. There are two different origin stories. One definitely aimed at children, and one... Okay. I wonder if all of the Bible stories are told twice. That's kind of interesting. Something to think about. Okay. Indeed, the Pentateuch is an expanded version of this basic narrative, which includes the following. We began as nomads, wanderers upon the earth without a home. We fell into slavery to the Lord of Egypt. God heard our groaning and liberated us from bondage, and God gave us a bountiful land in which to live. Okay, so this next section is called historical illumination. Chico? Come here, baby. My old orange boy is sitting in the hallway in the sunshine. Okay, historical illumination. The exodus from Egypt under the leadership of Moses probably happened in the 13th century BCE. The stories of Israel's nomadic ancestors, Abraham and Sarah, are set a few hundred years earlier. For many centuries, both Jews and Christians routinely spoke of the Pentateuch as the 5 books of Moses and took it for granted that Moses, aided by God, was the author. Thus, the Pentateuch was seen as roughly contemporary with the events that it describes. But modern historical scholarship, beginning in the 17th century, has rejected the notion of Mosaic authorship for good reasons. Instead, it sees the earlier accounts of Israel's beginnings as having been written much later. As mentioned in the previous chapter, some scholars think that the earliest extended narrative in the Pentateuch may have been written as early as 900 BCE, the J source. The other scholars think that the narratives were written significantly later. In any case, the completed narrative in its present form, with its combination of stories and laws, is quite late, written during or after the Jewish exile in Babylon in the 500 BCEs, and perhaps finalized as late as the time of Ezra in the 400 BCE, which is note 3. See the story of public reading of the Book of the Law of Moses by Ezra in, I guess that's Nehemiah 8 and 9. Obviously, some stories in the Pentateuch were being told centuries earlier. The 8th century prophets of Israel and Judah refer to the Exodus and the ancestors. See, for examples, Amos 2:10, 3:1, 9:7, and Micah 6:4. And it's one thing that's very important to remember when you are reading these stories, that this was an oral tradition for a very, very, very long time. that being the problem. And I think that's why he called it the story crystallized. Oral storytellers prided themselves on their memory. They were taught these stories and they memorized these stories. But I will bet you that every clan had a slightly different version of it. So until you actually write them down and take every clan stories and then make them all agree, that's where the story, then it hits its final form. So these stories were oral stories for a very long time. When they wrote them down is when it crystallized them, and then suddenly everybody's stories had to agree. Because now your story had to agree with the written version. It's really, really important to remember that these stories are far older than their written versions, but there were probably a lot of variations in the oral stories. Okay. All right. Let me get back to where was note 3. My primary concern in this chapter is with Israel's story of origin in its present form, and not with the reconstruction of the history that lies behind it. Mostly because, you're chasing your tail with historical. You just really are. Because we want to look at the moon, not the finger pointing at the moon. Okay. Nevertheless, when it seems illuminating to make some observations about the possible history behind the stories, I will do so. Paradoxically, the primary effect of such observations is to turn attention from historical reconstruction to the metaphorical reading of these narratives. Again, like I said, we want to be looking at the moon, not the finger pointing at the moon. Okay. The fathers and mothers of Israel. The stories of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob, Leah, and Rachel, and their 12 sons, the fathers of Israel's 12 tribes, are found in Genesis 12 through 50. The question of historicity. I begin with a memory from my first seminary course on the Hebrew Bible some 35 years ago. I recall sitting at my desk in my dorm room in New York City, listening to an FM radio station, a new experience for a young man from the remote northern Midwest, and doing the reading assignment for the next day's class. By then, I had learned that the first part of Genesis was a mythical prologue to the Pentateuch, and that Israel's history began with the stories of the fathers of Israel, the patriarchs, as they were called in those days, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and his 12 sons. At the time of Abraham, the time of Abraham was commonly said to be about 1700 BCE. The assignment consisted of conflicting essays about whether the patriarchs were historical or legendary figures. Did Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and his 12 sons really exist? Or were they legendary personifications of tribal groups? It also included a short essay on when camels were domesticated. Its conclusion, whereas asses had been domesticated by the alleged time of Abraham, camels had not been. I'm not sure camels have been domesticated now, but that's a different story. The effect of the assignment was a strong feeling of vertigo. So I thought, let me see if I've got this right. Our tradition begins with Abraham, but he might never have existed. And if he did, he was an ass nomad, not a camel nomad. Somewhat irreverently, but not without fear and trembling, I wondered why, even if he did exist, I should take seriously what happened to him, an ass nomad from the 1700 BCE. What did he know about anything? The foundation of the tradition seemed to be crumbling. I recovered from the vertigo of that evening, but I still do not have an opinion about the historicity of the stories of Abraham and Sarah and their immediate descendants. I have realized, though, that their historicity doesn't matter, or does not matter. What does matter are the two questions raised in the previous chapter. Why did Israel tell these stories? And why did she tell them this way? Okay, so the next section is titled Promise and Fulfillment. The theme of promise and fulfillment provides the overarching structure and narrative flow of the Pentateuch. Right? The promise is found in the dramatic beginning of the story of Abraham and Sarah in Genesis 12, 1-2. God calls the two of them to leave home and family and embark on a journey to a land they do not know. Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation. The promise is twofold: the land of Canaan and a multitude of descendants. Now we have note 4. The promise is repeated and amplified in subsequent chapters. In Genesis 15:5, God promises Abraham descendants as numerous as the stars of the heavens. In 17:1-8, God promises to Abraham and his offspring an everlasting covenant and all the land of Canaan. Canaan is the name of the geographical area that eventually becomes Israel, or became Israel. Okay. Ooh, I'm going to snag a drink really quick. The rest of the Pentateuch is the story of the fulfillment of this promise. Okay. So we start with the promise and then spend the rest of the chapters on the fulfillment. Interesting. Okay. Let me read that sentence again. So, the rest of the Pentateuch is the story of the fulfillment of this promise. The Pentateuch ends several hundred years later with the descendants of Abraham at the Jordan River ready to cross over to Canaan, the promised land. The theme of promise and fulfillment is central not only to the Pentateuch as a whole, but to many of its individual stories. These stories often dramatize and intensify the theme of promise and fulfillment by adding a third element, a threat to the promise, a formidable obstacle to its fulfillment. As in a sacred melodrama, the ancestors find themselves in one predicament after another. Will God be able to fulfill the promise despite what looks like hopeless circumstances? Okay, so we're going to start with the barrenness of the matriarchs. Of the many stories of threats to the promise that could be cited, I focus on a repeating theme about the mothers of Israel. The matriarchs are barren. Abraham and Sarah's role in the theme is well known. Though promised a multitude of descendants, Sarah is both barren and old. So the couple tries surrogate parenthood. Sarah gives her maidservant Hagar to Abraham, and Hagar bears him his son Ishmael. But for the narrator of Genesis, this is not the fulfillment. It will not be brought about by human ingenuity. Now, I don't know if he's going to deal with this, but if he doesn't, one of the things that you might find interesting is that when in Islam, they tell the story of Abraham and Sarah as well, and how Hagar bears Abraham the son Ishmael. And then when Sarah has her son, Hagar and Ishmael are banished. And so they travel to what eventually becomes, I forget which country it is, but the Ishmael is the progenitor of of Islam. So the Jewish and the Islam, or the Hebrew and the Islam, have the same father, Abraham, just in two different, but they have different mothers and in different situations. So it's interesting. And when I learned that, I was like, oh. So and you can contrast the beginnings of Israel with the beginnings of Islam in the way the matriarchs are treated and how the sons come out. So yeah, look it up. It's interesting. Okay. But I don't think he's going to deal with that because he's focused on the Hebrew Bible. Okay. So that was what we call a side note. Then, when Sarah is 90 and Abraham is 99, when humanly speaking, it is impossible, Sarah conceives and gives birth to Isaac. The father and mother of Israel have finally have a descendant, and the narrator hardly needs to say, only because of God. Now we have note 5. Abraham and Sarah's inability to have a child is a major theme in Genesis 12 through 21. And the next several notes just tell you where he's taking the Bible passages from. So that's interesting. Okay. All right. Let's see. Less well known is the repetition of this theme in the next 2 generations. Isaac, Abraham and Sarah's son, marries Rebekah, who, like Sarah, is barren. Through 20 years of marriage, they have no children. Then God answers Isaac's prayer, and Rebekah gives birth to Esau and Jacob, which is note 6, Genesis 25, 19 through 26. Jacob is now the child of promise. He falls in love with Rachel, but is tricked into marrying her sister Leah as well. Leah, whom we are told he does not love, is marvelously fertile, but Rachel, whom he does love, is barren. After many years, we are told God opens Rachel's womb and she gives birth to Joseph, who later saves his brothers, the ancestors of the 12 tribes of Israel, in a time of famine, which is note 7, Genesis 29, 21 through 30.24. Oh, maybe it's 29:21 through 30:24. Okay, sorry. Let's see. What are we to make of this theme of barrenness in the matriarchs? Why did the storytellers of Israel tell the story this way? By narrating these stories as threats to the promise, they intensify the theme of promise and fulfillment. The story, as Israel tells it, even when it looks as if birth is impossible, when it seems there is no hope, when we fear that we have no future, when the promises of God seem like pipe dreams, even then, God finds a way to fulfill the promises made to our ancestors. Okay. Ooh, oh, that's just the lid. Okay. Joseph and his brothers. So, hang on, now I'm going to think about this for a minute. The 11 of the brothers are Leah's children, and Joseph is Rebekah's child. Interesting. So Joseph, the gifted one, has a different mother than the rest of his brothers. I guess I'd never... Okay, something to think about. So, Joseph and his brothers. The theme of promise and fulfillment, with the added drama of threat, is also central to the rich collection of stories that conclude the book of Genesis. Like a novella, Genesis 37 through 47 tells us about Joseph and his brothers, the sons of Jacob, and the fathers of the 12 tribes of Israel. To condense these wonderfully written and often adventurous stories into a summary is a bit of a shame, but I do so now in order to show their connection to the theme of promise, threat, and fulfillment. Joseph, the favorite son of Jacob and Rachel, is a dreamer and an interpreter of dreams. His brothers become homicidally jealous of him. Having first planned to kill him, the brothers sell him into slavery instead, and then they tell their father that Joseph is dead. Joseph ends up in Egypt as a servant. Through a series of adventures, he rises to the position of chief overseer, second in authority and power only to the Pharaoh. He is placed in charge of organizing the storage of food in anticipation of a 7-year famine disclosed to him through the interpretation of dreams. The famine strikes. Back home in the land of Canaan, hunger drives the family of Joseph to go to Israel in search of food. They do not even suspect that Joseph might still be alive, much less imagine him as a person of power in Egypt. But they meet. Though Joseph recognizes them, they do not recognize him. Finally, Joseph tells them who he is. I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And then he says these extraordinary words. Do not be distressed. They might well have been afraid, or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. This is note 8, which is Genesis 45, 4 through 5 and 7 and 8, which makes you wonder what 6 was. But if you want to know, you're going to have to go look it up. This is an extraordinary claim. Joseph affirms, seeing things in retrospect, that even the event that ripped him from his homeland and family and sent him into slavery has been turned by God into a providential purpose. In the Joseph stories, the threat to promise was twofold. First, Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. The one who was to be the savior of Israel in his time was betrayed by his brothers. Second, the famine left the ancestors of Israel desperate. But the narrator of Genesis turns the story into one of fulfillment in spite of these threats to the promise, and he does so in a strikingly provocative and evocative way. It is never the will of God that one sell one's brother into slavery. Betrayal of that sort is always horrendous and wrong. Yet, God can take even so great an atrocity and make it serve the providential purposes of God. God can be counted on to fulfill the promises made to Israel, the people of God. Even when they're getting in their own way. Just a thought. The theme of promise and fulfillment connects closely to the theme of creation with which Genesis begins. Just as the world comes into existence through God and is sustained by God, so the people of God come into existence through the call and promise of God and continue to exist only because of God's faithfulness. In the stories of the ancestors, God saves Israel from the abyss of nothingness again and again. But the worst threat to the promise is yet to come. Genesis ends with Joseph's family, his father, Jacob, his brothers, and their households settling in Egypt. There they prosper and live out their lives. Jacob dies, then Joseph, then his brothers. Their descendants remain. Israel is now in Egypt. Okay. The Exodus, Israel's primal narrative. We now turn to Israel's story of the Exodus, shorthand for the rest of the core story that shapes the Pentateuch as a whole. The Exodus story includes Israel's time of slavery in Egypt, the Exodus itself, the covenant and the laws given at Sinai, and the 40-year journey through the wilderness to the promised land. In this story, we encounter Israel's primal narrative, which is note 9. I owe the phrase primal narrative to Walter Begman. The Bible Makes Sense from 1997, especially chapter 3. He emphasizes meaning 1 of first importance. First importance. Primal narrative. The Exodus story is a primal in 3 meanings of the word. First, primal means of greatest importance. Throughout Israel's history, the Exodus story was the most important story she knew. Second, primal means originary or originating. The events narrated in the story give birth to Israel. It is her story of origins par excellence. Third, primal means archetypal. This story narrates the perennial struggle between the world of empire and the liberating will of God, between the lordship of Pharaoh and the lordship of God. And we have note 10. The connection between primal and archetypal is suggested by the roots of the latter. Arch means beginning, and tupos means impression, as in an impression made by a seal in wax, or by a piece of type on a sheet of paper. Archetype thus means something imprinted from the beginning that reoccurs again and again. An archetype imprints itself again and again. Okay. Huh? Good to know. Interesting. Okay. All right. Like biblical narratives generally, Israel's primal narrative combines historical memory with metaphorical narrative. Though the Exodus story contains some history remembered, it is not what we think. It's not what we think of as a historical reporting. Rather, it is history metaphorized. Okay. As the storytellers of Israel narrate the Exodus, they make use of remarkable literary artistry, dramatic hyperbole, and extraordinary numbers. Many of the scenes are exceptionally memorable, filled with both theological and psychological insights. The stories of the 10 plagues and the crossing of the sea tell of stupendous, miraculous interventions. According to the book of Exodus, the number of Israelites who left Egypt was 600,000 men plus women and children, presumably a total of 2 to 3 million. Now we have note 11. Exodus 2:37. That this number is impossibly large is suggested by a number of factors. This may have been more than the population of Egypt at the time. Moreover, such a large group could not possibly have spent an extended period of time in the wilderness, which was mostly desert. Finally, it is probably more than the population of Israel some 300 years later in the 900 BCE, during the time of the United Kingdom under David and Israel. Rather than reflecting historical fact, the number is a product of the storyteller's dramatic license, which, knowing what I know about storytelling in that era and in that time that time period, and in that region, that is part of the dramatic license. Storytellers exaggerate, and their audience knows that they exaggerate. So this was not a secret. When they would use these great big long numbers and they use this really long time period, their audience knew that the storyteller was exaggerating. It's not a secret. It was not a secret. And it wasn't done to trick the audience. It was done for the dramatics of the storytelling. So, the fact that we get a little bent out of shape over these numbers, it's because we expect it to be factual when the audience knew that the numbers were exaggerated for the purposes of telling the story. Okay? And that's the difference between us as a modern audience and the audiences that would have heard these stories. They expected those ridiculously large numbers because it was part of the story. It was part of the fun of the story. Okay? So keep that in mind. This is because I know a whole lot about mythology, and that's why I know this, and that's why I know about story. Some of the side notes that you're getting. It's just because it's my background. My background is in anthropology and archaeology and world mythology. It's what I went to school for. All right. Now I have to figure out where I was. Oh, there I am. A couple of generations of Americans have had their impressions of the Exodus shaped by Cecil B. DeMille's 1950s epic movie, The Ten Commandments, still shown each year near Easter on network television. And it probably still is today. 20 years later. Or 25 years later. Though the movie allows itself some Hollywood license, it basically takes the Bible story literally. God speaking to Moses through the burning bush, sending the 10 plagues against Egypt, dividing the sea into 2 towering walls of water with a canyon of dry land between, writing the 10 commandments on 2 tablets of stone with a flaming finger, and so forth. Like all literalizations of metaphorical narratives, it makes the frankly incredible. Nevertheless, the Exodus story is rooted in the historical experience of ancient Israel. The memory of having been Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt is indelibly printed on the pages of the Hebrew Bible and etched in the life of ancient Israel. It is delineated not only in the Pentateuch itself, but in the Psalms and the writings of the prophets, as well as in Israel's rituals and liturgies. But the Exodus probably involved a few thousand people rather than a few million, and whatever historical events lie behind the stories of the plagues and the crossings of the sea, the texts are not simply reporting what happened. But, for my present purposes, none of this matters. Rather, as in the first section of this chapter, my primary focus will be on the story in its present form, not on a historical reconstruction of what happened. Near the end of the chapter, I will make a few more observations on the history behind the text. But, for now, we concentrate on the story itself. Throughout, my emphasis will be on this is the way Israel told the story. And again, another side note, because like I said, my undergraduate degree is in archaeology, in anthropology, and there is a whole branch called biblical archaeology. And that's the point of biblical archaeology, is to look for historical evidence, archaeological evidence of the events of the Bible. And I have a funny relationship with it, which is not worth going into here. But it's still something that we do now. There's a show on Discovery Channel called Expedition Unknown. And Josh Gates, the host of it, who, like me, has a degree in archaeology, one of the things he has explored is looking for evidence of the Exodus from Egypt. And he's found some compelling evidence that, yes, there was a contingent of Israelites living in Egypt in a particular period. So it's one of those things. But what, for his purposes and for our purposes of reading the Bible, That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It matters why she's telling the story and how she's telling the story. So, let's get on with it. Although I'm going to grab a drink really quick first. All right, Egypt and bondage. The most severe threat to the promise made to the ancestors begins when a new pharaoh comes to power in Egypt. The first chapter of Exodus solemnly announces the change. Now, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Note 12. Which just tells you this is Exodus 1:8. The result, Israel is enslaved by imperial power. Now in bondage to the lordship of Pharaoh, she is condemned to unremitting hard labor. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks they imposed upon them. Note 13. Exodus 1:13 through 14. And even worse, the imperial power in charge of the Israelites' world orders the killing of all male babies born to the Hebrews. Imperial oppression is now combined with genocide. Under the power of the empire, Israel has no future. Moses. Into this world, Moses is born. It is no accident that the Pentateuch has long been associated with Moses. His birth is narrated at the beginning of Exodus and his death in the final chapter of Deuteronomy, the last book of the Pentateuch. In between is the story of his life as the liberator, lawgiver, and leader of Israel. Moses towers over the Pentateuch. Other than God, he is the central figure in Israel's primal narrative. The story of Moses' infancy is well known. Note 14. The next several paragraphs up through the call of Moses are based on Exodus 2-3. Seeking to save the baby from the death sentence of Pharaoh, his mother hides him in a floating basket among the bulrushes along the bank of the Nile. There he is found by Pharaoh's daughter. She not only adopts him, but unknowingly hires his mother as his nursemaid. The future liberator of Israel is then raised in the imperial household. Now grown up, Moses one day sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. He intervenes, kills the Egyptian, hides the body in the sand, and flees Egypt. A fugitive from the empire, he finds refuge in Midian, marries a woman of that region, has a son, and becomes a shepherd. Many years pass. In Egypt, the situation of the Hebrew slaves worsens. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of their slavery, their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered the covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them. 15. Note 15. Exodus 2:23 through 25. I had a thought, but I'm going to keep that one to myself. The twofold repetition of groaning, crying, and slavery underlines the desperation of the Israelites' plight. God hears their groaning, remembers the covenant, looks upon them, and takes notice of them. Immediately thereafter, God calls Moses to be the liberator of Israel. While tending his flock at Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, Moses has a numinous experience, an experience of the sacred that changes his and Israel's life forever. It is the famous story of the burning bush. So Moses has a mystical experience. Okay, hang on. Let's see here. The angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of bush. He looked, and the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Note 16, Exodus 3:2. Moses sees a bush blazing with light, filled with the divine radiance. This is the first of several direct experiences of God reported about Moses. Like Abraham and Jacob before him, he is described as having first-hand experience of the sacred. Note 17. Abraham had visions, Genesis 15:1 through 17, 17:1 through 22, 18:1 through 15. Jacob saw a flaming ladder connecting heaven and earth and exclaimed, "Truly, this is the gate of heaven," which is Genesis 10 through 17. Then God speaks to him out of the bush and calls him to go back to Egypt. "I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their suffering, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Note 18, which is Exodus 3:7 through 8 and 10. Moses is reluctant and resists. Now here is a classic hero's journey. Refusal of the call. Moses went, no. Because in all hero's journey, that's exactly what happens. Somebody comes to the hero and goes, "All right, I need you to do this." And the hero goes, no. So, refusal of the call here. If you are familiar with the hero's journey. If you're not, look it up. It's interesting. Okay. He asked, "If I do this and the Israelites ask me about the name of God who has sent me, what shall I say?" The answer God gives him still mystifies. "I am who I am." Note 19. Exodus 3:14. What does this response mean? Formally, the statement is tautology, in which the second half repeats the first half without supplying any further information. But does that mean the answer says nothing, or does it mean that God is ineffable, beyond all words? Or, as some scholars suggest, should the phrase be translated, "I will be present as I will be present," thus affirming both divine presence and divine freedom? Oh. Well, that puts a whole different spin on it. "I am who I am" versus "I will be present as I will be present." Okay. Why it's worth reading the notes and why I'm doing it. Moses finally agrees and with his brother Aaron returns to Egypt. So is his brother Aaron his brother or his brother-in-law? Just had that thought. I was like, wait, where did Aaron come from? I bet it's his brother-in-law. So hang on. Confrontation with the Pharaoh, the plagues. Moses and Aaron appear before the Pharaoh and announce the divine imperative to the imperial power that rules their world. "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go." Let my people go. An imperative, not a plea, is the repeated refrain over the next several chapters. Pharaoh's response is haughty and contemptuous. "Who is the Lord that I should let Israel go?" Moreover, he increases the work burden of the Hebrew slaves, saying, "You are lazy, lazy." Note 20. Exodus 5:1 and 17. Thus, then, begins a series of dramatic episodes in which God sends plague after plague against the empire. The plague afflict the Egyptians, but not the Israelites. And he's... Bullet points. The Nile and all the other water in Egypt turns to blood. Frogs fill the land. Gnats afflict human and animals alike. Flies ruin the land. All the livestock of the Egyptians die. Boils attack the Egyptians and their animals. Hail kills all exposed Egyptians and animals and ruins half the crops. Locusts consume the rest of the crops, and a thick darkness covers the land for 3 days. We now have note 21. Okay. Ooh, that is a long note. That is a very long note. Okay. The first 9 plagues are narrated in 7:14 through 10:29. They reflect the dramatization of storytelling. For example, although the 5th plague kills all of the livestock of Egypt, there was still livestock alive to be killed in the subsequent plagues of boils and hail. We are also repeatedly told that God hardened Pharaoh's heart. On the one hand, this is an explanation of why Pharaoh is not impressed enough by the plagues to let Israel go. On the other hand, it also affirms that even Pharaoh is under the control of Israel's God. But presumably, God never hardens anybody's heart. The plagues are also referred to in Psalm 78, 42 through 51. There are 7 listed: water turned to blood, flies, frogs, caterpillars, and locusts, hail and frost, plague on the humans or animals, ? And the death of the firstborn. Not mentioned are gnats, boils, and thick darkness. Given the difference in genres, a psalm instead of a narrative, not much weight should be given to the variances. It is interesting, though, that the 2 lists make use of the common biblical numbers 10 and 7. Okay. Whew. All right. I'm going to go ahead and read this. I think I have a comment, but I'm going to read this first. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and still occasionally today, it was common for historical scholars to seek to correlate plagues with natural phenomena known to occur in Egypt. But such correlations miss the point. By seeking to save the historicity of the plague stories with natural explanations, they eliminated the central claim made by the storytellers of Israel. God did this. It was God who sent the plagues and brought us out of Egypt with a great and mighty hand. But even after 9 plagues, Pharaoh still refuses the imperative to let my people go, and so the most devastating plague strikes: the death of the firstborn of all Egyptians, including Pharaoh's son. The Israelites are spared by smearing blood upon the doorposts and lintels of their dwelling, so that God will pass over their houses. Thus, in the midst of the 10th plague, the festival of Passover is established. But the empire is not spared. Okay, so we have note 22. The 10th plague is described in 11, 9 through 1, and 12, 29 through 32. The regulations for Passover are given in 12, 1 through 28. Okay. And he's right. Every so many years, somebody will come up with a new explanation of the plagues of Egypt. And I've seen some really good ones. One of my favorites is the rivers turning to blood is an algae bloom, which kills the fish and drives the frogs out of the water, which then, when the frogs dry out and die, then gnats are everywhere because the gnats are using the frog, the gnats and the flies are, born of the frogs decaying in the streets. And then because of the flies everywhere carrying disease, then the livestock die because they're getting bitten by the flies. And then because the livestock and everybody's being bitten by flies, hence the Egyptians get the boils. I don't know. The hail, that's one where they're like, well, we can't explain that. The locusts, well, everybody has locust stories. And then the darkness, they always attribute that to a volcano erupting somewhere. So you see that the plagues can fall one upon another. And I've also seen an explanation on why the firstborn son dies in the family is because when there is famine, the firstborn child is given the best food so that the firstborn child will survive. Okay. Well, if the food is contaminated by, i.e. an algal, it's called an algal bloom, then you are giving contaminated food to the firstborn child, who then dies of the poison, the toxin in the food. But as he says, so we can have this logical explanation of the plagues of Egypt, but it misses the point. It misses the point. So, just as I said, side note. All right, let's move back into the liberation and the sea. The death of all firstborns does it. Pharaoh finally relents and lets the Israelites leave Egypt. But almost immediately he changes his mind. His army pursues the fleeing slaves and catches up to them at the sea. With the water in front of the Israelites and the army of the empire behind them, the threat to God's promise is again acute. Israel faces extermination. Then occurs the event that has been remembered and celebrated in Jewish and Christian liturgies ever since. God causes the waters to fall back. The Israelites cross, Pharaoh's army and chariots become mired in the mud, the sea returns, and they drown. God has rescued Israel. That is note 23. Exodus 14. The identity of the body of water is unknown, though older translations refer to it as the Red Sea. The Hebrew phrase means the Sea of Reeds, possibly referring to a shallow and marshy area near the shore of a body of water. Moreover, the story refers to both a strong wind driving the sea back all night long, as might happen to the shallow end of a body of water, and to the sea dividing in the middle. See 14:21 through 22. Ugh. Okay. The deliverance of Israel at the sea is celebrated scripturally in a magnificent hymn of praise to God, commonly called the Song of Moses, and filling almost all of Exodus 15. It obviously comes from a much later date. It praises God not only for the victory over the Egyptians, but also for the conquest of Canaan. Its last line refers to the mountain and the place and the sanctuary, where God has chosen to dwell. Apparently a reference to the Temple of Jerusalem built by King Solomon on Mount Zion in the 900s BCE, which is note 24. This seems the most natural meaning of the language. Some scholars have suggested that the reference is not to the temple of God's dwelling place and sanctuary, but to the Holy Land as a whole as God's dwelling place. In any case, the hymn reflects a time considerably later than the events it describes. There may be a much more ancient hymn behind this one. Many scholars think that the Song of Moses is based on a much shorter hymn at the end of the chapter known as the Song of Miriam, the sister of Moses, which is note 25. Miriam is named in Exodus as Aaron's sister. In Numbers 26:59, she is also spoken of as Moses' sister. In Micah 6:4, she, Moses, and Aaron are referred to as the three leaders of the Exodus. Whoops. Hang on. Okay. Sing to the Lord, for God has triumphed graciously. Horse and rider God has thrown into the sea. Oh, wait. I skipped a line here. Called a prophet in that hymn, Miriam takes a tambourine and leads the women in song and dance. Sing to the Lord, for God has triumphed graciously. Horse and rider God has thrown into sea. In the judgment of many scholars, this poetic couplet may be the oldest part of the Hebrew Bible. Oh, that's interesting. The oldest part of the Hebrew Bible is attributed to a woman. Interesting. Okay, from the sea, the liberated slaves continue their journey through the desert to Mount Sinai, led and nourished by God. God guides them with a pillar of cloud by day and a column of fire by night. God quenches their thirst with water from a rock. God feeds them with manna, a bread-like substance that falls from the sky each morning, and with quails that cover the ground each evening. Note 26. The journey to Sinai and God's provision of guidance, food and drink in the desert are described in Exodus 6 through 18. In Numbers 11, 31, and 32, we are told that the quails covered the ground to a depth of 2 cubits, about 3 feet. Wow, that is a lot of quail. Okay. Oh, all right. Sinai and the covenant. What happens at Sinai occupies a major portion of the Pentateuch. It takes the narrator of Egypt 18... my apologies, let me back up. Let me try this again. What happens at Sinai occupies a major portion of the Pentateuch. It takes the narrator of Exodus 18 chapters to tell the story of bondage in Egypt, the call of Moses, and the confrontation with Pharaoh, and the plagues, the departure from Egypt, and the crossing of the sea, the journey to Sinai. The events at Sinai take the remaining 22 chapters of Exodus, all of the 27 chapters of Leviticus, the first 10 chapters of Numbers, and so 59 chapters in all. Okay. Theophany and the covenant. The Sinai events begin in Exodus 19 with a stupendous theophany, a manifestation of God, or hierophany, manifestation of the sacred. Thunder and lightning erupt. The sound of an ear-splitting trumpet can be heard as a thick cloud covers the sacred mountain. As God descends upon the mountain in fire, it violently quakes. Moses ascends the mountain, and there, at the place where heaven and earth meet, goes to meet God. Moses' role as mediator of the covenant and giver of the divine law has begun. What happens at Sinai is that Israel becomes a people, a nation. Through the narrator of the Pentateuch, though the narrator of the Pentateuch has frequently used the words Israelites and Israel earlier in the story, it is here that Israel comes into existence. Here, God offers the people a covenant. You have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. Okay. And that's note 27, which is Exodus 19, 4 through 6. With the offer and acceptance of the covenant of God, they become God's treasured possession and a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. And yet, one of the things that you want to keep in mind, and I cannot remember if he says it in this book, but it is one of the things that I learned in one of my classes and have heard in other places. A priestly kingdom and a treasured possession. It wasn't an easy life. They were signing up for work. They were signing up for an assignment. They were signing up for, and I cannot remember what the word is, but they were signing up to do the work to heal the rift that happened in the beginning. So treasured possession and priestly kingdom was not meant to be an easy life. It was meant that, yes, we agree to do this assignment, to do this healing work. So anybody who wants to point to this and go, well, Israel has it easy being the chosen people. Yeah, no, they didn't. They were signing up for a pretty hard task. So, interesting side note again. All right. The giving of the law. Most of the chapters covering what happens at Sinai consist of the laws given by God through Moses to Israel. They include the 10 Commandments in 2 slightly different forms, the Book of the Covenant, and the rest of the laws of Exodus, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy. Here we've got note 28. The 10 Commandments are found in Exodus 21 through 17 and Deuteronomy 5, 6 through 21. The Book of the Covenant is found in Exodus 20, 22 and 23. Oh, no, sorry. Chapter 20, verse 22 through chapter 23, 33. Okay. It is clear that these laws, drawn from many different periods in Israel's history, have accumulated over a period of centuries. Okay. Note 29. Many of them also have parallels in other ancient Near Eastern law codes. See Joseph Blenkinsop, the Pentateuch, 20 through 24. You can also look at the Code of Hammurabi. I think that's what it's called. Because a lot of the laws in the Code of Hammurabi are similar to the laws that you find in Leviticus and Deuteronomy. So, pretty interesting. Okay, where was I? But all are presented as God's revelation to Moses on the sacred mountain, and all go back to a time of sacred beginnings. I want to note that. Okay, got that. As mentioned in the introduction of this chapter, they include ethical and ritual laws as well as civil and criminal laws. Some of them express broad ethical principles with a wide application, such as you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Many are highly specific rules dealing with issues such as what foods may and may not be eaten, what the penalty is for cursing one's parents. By the way, that's death. What to do when an ox gores a person or another ox, what to do after an emission of semen, and so forth. So we have note 30. Respectively, Leviticus 9:18, Exodus 21:17, Leviticus 11:1 through 47, Exodus 20:28 through 36, Leviticus 15:16 through 18. These laws also include some of the most radical socioeconomic legislation in human history. For example, no interest is to be charged on loans to fellow Israelites. Especially striking are the regulations for the Sabbath year and Jubilee year. Every Sabbath, which is the 7th year, all debts owed by Israelites to other Israelites are to be forgiven, and all Hebrew slaves released. Note 31. That's Deuteronomy 15, 1 through 18. Every Jubilee, which is the 50th year, all agricultural land is to be returned at no cost to the original family of ownership. Note 32. Leviticus 25. A bit of background. When the Israelites settled in the land of Canaan, every family was given a plot of agricultural land. Over time, families that ran into difficulties sometimes lost their land because of debt. In the Jubilee year, the land was restored to the original family of ownership. So radical is this law of the Pentateuch that it may never have been observed, with the possible exception in the 1400s during the beginning of Nimina. I find that a little disappointing that that law was never observed. Oh, well, okay. These laws reflect Israel's origin in Egypt as radically oppressed and marginalized people. Their purpose was to prevent the emergence of a permanently impoverished class within Israel. Yep. Okay. Also, just again, side note on some of the laws, when you look at what they could and couldn't eat, if you remember that they were a desert people without refrigeration, it makes sense why they don't want you eating pork, because trichinosis is a thing. It makes sense that they don't want you eating shellfish because shellfish, I forget what toxin that they have when they start to go, but like they legit can kill you. So some of these dietary laws, they made them religious laws, but they were literally to keep people from eating things that would kill them. So, when you read these dietary restrictions, you have to keep that in mind. Desert people, no refrigeration. All right. Again, that was my side note. We are getting close to being finished, which is a good thing because I am straight up losing my voice. Okay. Israel's infidelity. There is yet one more theme to the Sinai story and the subsequent journey through the wilderness to the promised land. Namely, the threat to God's promise now coming from within Israel itself. In several episodes, most famously in the story of the golden calf that the Israelites erect while Moses is with God on the mountain, Israel becomes unfaithful to God. Note 33. The story of the golden calf and its sequel are found in Exodus 32 through 34. Sorry. God, the liberator of Israel, then threatens to become the destroyer of Israel. But Moses intercedes. God relents, and in another theophany, renews the covenant with the people. In the middle of this episode, Moses again meets God on Sinai. We are told that God passes before him and proclaims, the Lord, a God compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping the steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the child to the 3rd and 4th generation. Note 34. So I'm sure that tells us where that came from. Yep. Exodus 34, 6 and 7. This speech is one of the classic characterizations of God in the Hebrew Bible. Okay. From Sinai to the promised land. Because of their infidelity, the Exodus generation is not allowed to enter the land that God promised to the ancestors. Instead, after they leave Sinai, they spend almost 40 years in the wilderness. Note 35. There are a lot of notes in this chapter. Numbers 10:11 reports their departure, and the rest of the book speaks of the years in the wilderness. As the book of Numbers ends, the descendants of the Exodus generation are camped in the plains of Moab, just east of the Jordan River, the border of the Promised Land. The Pentateuch then coincides with the book of Deuteronomy, structured as a series of speeches spoken by Moses to the people of Israel just before they crossed the Jordan. Note 36. The book of Deuteronomy is commonly dated to 600 BCE. It, or a portion of it, is often identified with a book discovered, which he has in quotes, by the way, in the Temple of Jerusalem in the year 621 BCE, which then served as the basis of the reforms of Israel's life and worship under King Josiah. See 2 Kings 22 through 23. Okay. Deuteronomy means second law, a fitting title since much of the book is a second giving or summary of the law. The final chapters of this book, rich in exceptional language, consists of Moses' farewell address to the people he has led for 40 years. Deuteronomy 34, the last chapter of the book, describes the death of Moses, who, at 120 years old, climbs to the top of Mount Nebo on the east side of the Jordan. From its summit, God shows him the whole of the promised land that he himself will not enter. About the land displayed before Moses' eyes, God says, "This is the land which I swore to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob, saying, I will give it to your descendants." Note 37, which is Deuteronomy 34:4. Then Moses dies, just as the promise that arches over the Pentateuch is about to be fulfilled. The narrator tells us that no one knows where Moses was buried. Jewish tradition suggests that God dug his grave and placed his body in it. The brief obituary that concludes Deuteronomy affirms, "Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses." For the narrator of Deuteronomy and the Jewish tradition ever since, Moses is the greatest of prophets. Okay. We're getting close. We got about 4 pages. Central meanings of Israel's primal narrative. I return briefly to the question of historicity, to the question of how much of the Exodus story and subsequent events really happened. I do so because of what it is at stake in the question. It is not simply that the modern mind has difficulty with the most spectacular events in the story and needs reassurance that they need not be taken literally. Rather, it is how we address the question of historicity. Rather, it is that how we address the question of historicity affects and is affected by how we see God and the way God interacts with the world. Okay. To use the story of the crossing of the sea as an example of something I'm getting tired. Okay. To use the story of the crossing of the sea as an example, something happened at the sea, but it was not the sea dividing into parallel walls of water with a canyon of dry land between them. To imagine that God acted to bring about that in the past violates the principle of divine consistency. Okay. Which is note 38. I owe this useful phrase to John Dominic Crossan. I cannot recall whether he used it in one of his books, but I have heard him use it in lectures. Divine consistency affirms that God acts now in the same way God acted in the past. Some might, and some do, argue with this claim. But the notion that God acted in fundamentally different ways in the past compared to how God acts now presents insurmountable difficulties. Why would God change how God acts? What possible reason can be imagined? If God intervened in such dramatic fashions then, why not now? And that right there is one of the reasons why good people sit on their hands and do nothing when bad things happen. Because they are waiting for God to intervene, forgetting that we are how God intervenes. So, I'm full on board with this argument. The issue for me is not whether paranormal events that have no reasonable reductionist explanation happen now. They do. And the issue is not whether there are movements of human liberation empowered by God now. There are. Rather, the issue is whether God has ever acted anywhere, anytime, as portrayed in the story of the plagues and the crossing of the sea. To say that God did act in Moses' day is to leave inexplicable the non-interventions in situations of intense human suffering in the centuries ever since. That's what I'm talking about. Why good people sit on their hands waiting for God to do it. It also risks making the story of Exodus irrelevant to subsequent generations. Okay. The narrative of the Israelites' rescue from Egypt would then become a story of what God did once upon a time, but no more. A story about how God jump-started Israel, but then became mysteriously inactive. Instead, as Israel's primal narrative, the Exodus account is a paradigmatic story of God's character and will. Okay. I will turn now to some of its meanings as Israel's primal narrative and paradigmatic story. The Exodus story was Israel's decisive and constitutive identity story. In the words of Walter Bregman, the best-known Hebrew Bible scholar in North America today, it is that most simple, elemental, and non-negotiable storyline which lies at the heart of biblical faith. It is an affirmation in story form which asserts this is the most important story we know, and we have come to believe it is decisively about us. Note 39. Bregman, The Bible Makes Sense, page 45 through 46. His commentary on Exodus in the New Interpreter's Bible is superb. Thankfully, we only have 4 more notes. For the ancient Israelites and for Jews ever since, this was the most important story they knew. It was the primal story shaping their understanding of divine-human relationship. Their identity, their life, together as a community, and their vision of the character of God. Within this story, Egypt and Pharaoh are a type, an archetype, of a widespread way of organizing human society. In the Exodus story, Egypt, of course, is Egypt. The ancestors of Israel were in bondage to the pharaohs of Egypt in the 13th century BCE. But Egypt is also a perfect type of ancient domination system, or the pre-industrial agrarian empire. A common form of society in the time of the emergence of the early agrarian empires in the 3000 BCE through the Middle Ages of the current era. These societies had 2 primary social classes: the urban ruling elites holding the reins of power, wealth, and status, consisted of the traditional aristocracy, with the monarchy at its center. With their extended families, these elites comprised about 1 to 2% of the population. The other primary social class, typically making up slightly over 90% of the population, was composed of rural peasants, mostly agricultural workers, but also fishers, artisans, and so forth. Note 40. Another 5% were called the retainers, basically a service class attached to the elites and consisting of the army, government officials, high-ranking servants and scribes, the upper level of priesthood, and so forth. I've taken this terminology and information on the typical shape of such society primarily from Gerhard Linsky, Power and Privilege, The Theory of Social Stratification, 1996. Ooh, I've read that book, I think. At least I've come across it. I've summarized this type of society elsewhere. See, for example, The God We Never Knew, page 134 through 36. Where was I? Oh, here we are. The key economic fact necessary to an understanding of the central dynamic of these societies is this. Roughly 2/3 of the annual production of wealth, mostly from agricultural and thus produced by peasants, ended up in the hands of the ruling elites. The means whereby they acquired their wealth were primarily twofold: taxation on agricultural production and direct ownership of agricultural lands, with the peasants working as sharecroppers, day laborers, or slaves. The consequences for peasants' existence were dire: unremitting labor, borderline nourishment, high infant mortality rates, and radically lower life expectations. To describe such societies with 3 phases, they were marked by economic exploitation, just described, political oppression, ordinary people have no voice in the structuring of society, and religious legitimization. The religion of the elites affirmed that the structures of society were ordained by God. And if you're not paying attention, history keeps repeating itself with this very thing. With all of the money going to the elites and the people who actually do the labor suffering. And we're looking at note 41. I owe the first 2 phrases to Walter Bregman, The Prophetic Imagination, 1978, chapter 1. He uses them to describe life under Pharaoh in the world of Egypt and often refers to this way of structuring society as royal consciousness. This is the world of Egypt and the world of empire, the world that Moses knew. Israel's primal narrative is the story of radical protest against and liberation from such a world, and it affirms that radical criticism of and liberation from such societies is the will of God. Moreover, the radical economic legislation of the Pentateuch was designed to prevent such a world from re-emerging. Indeed, early Israel, for roughly the first 200 years after gaining the Promised Land, was a remarkably egalitarian society, one with universal land ownership and no monarchy. Okay. It just didn't last. The message of the Pentateuch was that God's people were to leave the world of Egypt and empire behind. Thus, Israel's primal narrative is profoundly political in the broadest sense of the word. Politics is about the shape and shaping of society. That's interesting. So then there are a whole lot of things that people keep saying aren't political, and yeah, they are, because they shape society. The Exodus story is about the creation of a world marked by freedom, social justice, and shalom, a rich Hebrew word meaning well-being, peace, and wholeness. It contrasts an Exodus worldview with a monarchical worldview. Yet, it is not simply political. At the center of Israel's primal narrative is God. God is the central reality to the story. And God's covenant with Israel begins. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You will have no other gods before me. Is note 42, which is Exodus 22 through 3. The Exodus story is not about social justice without God. Equally, it is not about God without social justice. Ancient Israel's primal narrative thus brings together 2 areas of life that we tend to separate: religious passion and social justice. God and this worldly liberation. Even the obituary of Moses at the end of Deuteronomy unites these 2 contrasts. It not only refers to Moses' central role in the Exodus, but also describes him as the one whom God knew face to face. Never since has there arisen a prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. He was unequaled for all the signs and wonders that the Lord sent him to perform in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants and the entire land, and for all the mighty deeds and the terrifying displays of power that Moses performed in the sight of all Israel. Note 43, which is Deuteronomy 34:10 through 12. Moses knew God, and Moses was the liberator of Egypt. In Moses, as in the story of the Exodus as a whole, the experience of God and the liberation from empire are brought together in opposition to the monarchical worldview. Finally, the story of the Exodus is framed by the theme of the Pentateuch as a whole. Promise and fulfillment. Both the Exodus story and the theme of promise and fulfillment were strikingly relevant to the situation of the Jewish people in exilic and post-exilic periods, the years when the Pentateuch was composed in its final and present form. In other words, when it was written down. They had been conquered, greatly reduced in numbers, and exiled by one imperial power. Now they lived under another imperial power. The promise of God that they would be a great nation seemed profoundly threatened, as did their very existence. In this setting, they remembered and celebrated the promise given to their ancestors, the stories of Israel's liberation from a previous imperial power, and the gift of a new land and a new life. Indeed, the theme of promise and fulfillment is strikingly relevant to people in all times. In spite of threats to the promise and seemingly insurmountable obstacles when birth and rebirth seem impossible, when pharaohs and the power of empire seem to rule the world, God's faithfulness can be counted on. And that is chapter 5, reading the Pentateuch again. I'm going to take a deep breath and a long drink of water and move on. And next Saturday, we will pick up with reading the prophets again, chapter 6. So this has been a wondrous day, a fantastic day, a magical day, an enchanted day, a wonderful day, an awesome day, an amazing day. I will see you.